Imagine a galaxy torn apart by Orks, Tyranids, and chaos forces, entire worlds on the brink of annihilation. And yet, there's someone walking among the carnage, unseen by anyone, bending fate itself. No one knows who he is, where he comes from, or how he does it. But every battle, every impossible survival, carries his invisible hand. Humanity has a secret guardian now, a force the enemies can't see, can't fight, and can't predict. What happens when the unseen champion decides it's time to strike? The moment John Cena materialized in the grimdark expanse of the Warhammer 40K galaxy, the very air around him seemed to distort. Stars warped slightly in the distance, as if the universe itself paused to register the presence of an entity that did not belong. He looked around, invisible even to the keenest of sensors deployed by the Imperium, his muscular frame moving with almost preternatural silence through a shattered cityscape on a hive world. Dust and debris floated gently around him, disturbed by the faintest motion of his presence, yet no one noticed. The Imperial Guard marched past, their flak armor glinting under distant sunlight, oblivious to the living anomaly walking amongst them. It was as if reality itself had acknowledged his intrusion and elected to hide him from the scrutiny of mortals and machines alike, granting him a ghostly cloak that defied both sight and comprehension. Amid the ruined towers and burning streets, John Cena's invisible form moved with purpose, though the galaxy had no way of understanding why. Sensors on battle tanks and recon drones recorded nothing but static as they swept the area, their data streams empty, suggesting only the absence of life. And yet, every so often, a barely perceptible ripple passed through the air, as if a massive force had shifted unseen. Imperial commanders scratched their heads over reports of ghost movements, while their soldiers whispered nervously about shadows that did not belong. The whispers grew into murmurs, stories told in hushed tones about a man who could not be seen, whose presence alone seemed to tilt the tides of battle. For John Cena, it was a bizarre yet exhilarating sensation. He had always been a larger-than-life figure in his own world, but here, in the grimdark galaxy, the scale was unimaginable. Entire regiments moved, fought, and died without the faintest notion that their battles were being silently influenced. Even the war machines of the Imperium could not comprehend his presence. Titans stomped across battlefields, their sensors scanning the horizon for threats that simply did not exist in a tangible form. Weapons discharged in arcs of fire, bullets and shells scattering across streets, striking only what they were aimed at, yet sometimes veering inexplicably as if nudged by some invisible hand. John Cena's movements were careful but decisive, a ghost among giants, threading through the chaos with the confidence of someone who understood that his existence, though unseen, carried weight beyond mortal reckoning. In the distance, the iconic banners of the Adeptus Astartes fluttered in the ash-laden winds, yet even these genetically enhanced warriors passed him by without the slightest awareness. Their minds, conditioned to anticipate and counter threats, were confounded by his impossibility. A living paradox they could neither fight nor embrace. The environment itself seemed to respond subtly to his presence. Fires flickered differently, shadows stretched where no physical source existed, and the very air hummed with an energy that sensors labeled as anomalous but could not explain. Buildings that had survived bombardments swayed as though acknowledging his passage, yet no force was visible to the naked eye. He stepped lightly across streets lined with the dead and dying, carefully avoiding contact, but somehow managing to redirect the course of a falling steel girder, saving a squad of guardsmen without them ever realizing it. To an observer, it was a miracle. To John Cena, it was a quiet exercise in discipline and control, moving through a world where the rules of visibility and power were entirely redefined. Every action was silent, every intervention invisible, yet the effects rippled outward in ways both subtle and profound. Even more fascinating was the reaction of the galaxy itself to his presence. Warp currents twisted unpredictably, perhaps sensing a force that neither belonged to the Imperium nor the material plane. Daemons paused mid-strike as he passed unseen, unnerved by the inexplicable void of awareness surrounding him. Orks bellowed and charged as usual, yet sometimes their swings missed by inches, as if some intangible barrier had interfered. John Cena, invisible and utterly alone, moved with the awareness of a predator and protector simultaneously, a silent guardian whose purpose was as enigmatic to him as it was to the galaxy he had stumbled into. Every step was a balancing act between intervention and observation, guiding the flow of events without ever tipping his hand, knowing that to be seen would shatter the delicate fabric of the role he had assumed in this brutal, unfeeling universe. In the shadow of enormous cathedrals and spires, he observed the Imperium's citizens going about their grim lives, unaware of the impossible presence nearby. The smell of smoke and ozone, the groans of the wounded, and the distant explosions of artillery painted a scene of relentless suffering and heroism, all unfolding without recognition of the invisible figure threading through it. Even the Mechanicus's most advanced detection arrays failed, their cogitators registering only fluctuations in ambient energy that made no sense, sparks of data dismissed as glitches. And yet, John Cena continued onward, a silent observer and unacknowledged participant, moving through an epic scale of war that dwarfed any spectacle from his previous life. The galaxy's enormity, its chaos, and its ceaseless violence were a playground for a man who could not be seen, but whose presence could never be ignored. The Space Marines on the edge of the battlefront began to notice something impossible. Their sensors, honed to detect even the faintest movement across kilometers of war-torn terrain, registered anomalies too subtle to be explained. The readings flickered like faulty data, impossible to trace to any known source, and yet they were persistent. Tactical officers muttered nervously over voxcasters, exchanging theories about hidden cults, Xenos infiltration, or even warp interference, But no explanation satisfied the creeping unease that spread through their ranks. Every clash of bolter fire seemed to carry a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, as if the tide of war were bending around an invisible hand. From the perspective of the armored warriors, it was as if the battlefield itself had developed a will, an unseen presence influencing outcomes with eerie precision that defied mortal understanding. On the ground, squads of tactical marines experienced strange phenomena that could not be quantified. Orders shouted across ravaged streets occasionally reached their comrades faster than humanly possible, and enemy movements often misaligned with logical tactics, leaving openings that would otherwise have been fatal. Sergeant Vorlaf observed his men reacting with uncanny reflexes to threats that had no discernible source, feeling a ghostly push in the direction of danger before it manifested. Even the most disciplined veterans exchanged uncertain glances, unable to identify whether they were witnessing a miracle, a trap, or the work of some unseen adversary. The fabric of causality seemed to warp subtly, as though some intangible agent were threading through the chaos, manipulating events without ever revealing its hand. High above the battlefield, the orbital command stations observed the conflict with their superior vantage point. Yet their auger arrays could detect nothing definitive. Scanners picked up faint energy fluctuations, pulses that resembled psychic emanations, but lacked coherent signatures. Some tech priests speculated about rogue psychers hidden among the ranks of the enemy, while others feared warp contamination influencing the sensors themselves. Even the librarians of the Space Marines, trained to sense disturbances in the Imperium, could not pinpoint the source. The presence was everywhere and nowhere, a paradoxical anomaly that seemed to defy logic and reason. In whispered conversation, officers referred to it as the Ghost, a force that manipulated outcomes while remaining perfectly concealed, its motives inscrutable and its form invisible to mortal eyes. Despite the confusion, the subtle interventions of the invisible force shaped the course of the battle in ways that were tangible to those on the ground. A volley of las fire that should have decimated a forward squad instead veered at the last instant, missing them by mere inches. Ork war bosses, who had charged with reckless abandon, suddenly tripped or collided with obstacles that appeared out of nowhere, as though some unseen hand guided the tide of chaos against itself. Even Tyranid organisms, creatures driven by primal instinct and hive-mind coordination, faltered inexplicably when crossing certain zones. Space Marines whispered of a guardian shadow, a presence acting without recognition, saving lives and tipping scales without being acknowledged or understood. It was a phenomenon that inspired awe, dread, and confusion simultaneously. A living paradox in a galaxy already steeped in contradictions and horrors beyond comprehension. As the battle raged on, the psychological effect of the unseen force became as potent as its subtle manipulations of physical reality. Troops began to anticipate threats that were never visible, responding to danger before it arrived. The morale of the Imperium forces shifted imperceptibly, their fear tempered by the sense that some unknown protector lingered amidst the carnage. Even the most cynical veterans noted moments where luck seemed almost sentient. Bullets missing by micro-inches, and grenades failing to detonate in their proximity. Commanders, relying on centuries of battle-hardened strategy, found themselves questioning conventional tactics, as if the battlefield had taken on a mind of its own. Rumors of a hidden champion spread quickly, whispered through Vox channels, and in the quiet moments between volleys of fire, as the concept of an invisible force began to take root in both imagination and reality. The enemy, however, was not entirely blind to the effects. Chaos daemons, sensitive to the ebb and flow of the Imperium, felt unease radiating through the warp. They paused mid-assault, their attacks faltering as if unseen chains tugged them off course. Orks, normally oblivious to subtlety, grew frustrated with inexplicable miscalculations that disrupted their seemingly chaotic tactics. Tyranid synapse creatures hesitated for reasons their instincts could not explain, giving humanity a narrow window to exploit gaps that no one could have planned for. The invisible influence operated like a silent puppeteer, directing outcomes without ever revealing its hand, reshaping encounters in ways subtle enough to escape detection, yet powerful enough to be felt. It was a silent war waged on perception and consequence, an enigma that could not be understood, only experienced. In the midst of the confusion, individual acts of heroism were magnified by the presence of the unseen entity. Soldiers who would have perished found themselves dodging lethal fire, their instincts inexplicably sharper, their strikes unnaturally precise. Tactical maneuvers executed with almost preternatural timing forced enemy units into disadvantageous positions. It was as if the invisible figure walked alongside every warrior, nudging them toward survival and victory without ever stepping into the light. Even the most seasoned officers struggled to reconcile the data from their observations with reality, knowing that the battlefield is behaving in ways no human or even machine should be capable of influencing. This contradiction fueled speculation and superstition as whispered conversations among the ranks evolved into theories about a blessing from the Emperor or an unseen hero guiding the Imperium's hand. Sensors and detection grids recorded anomalies with maddening inconsistency, failing to provide a coherent pattern for analysis. Tech priests debated endlessly, arguing over corrupted data or unknown psychic interference, while librarians stared at nothing in particular, trying to discern meaning from the shifting currents of the warp. Some suggested a rogue entity, perhaps a Xenos operative of unimaginable capability, yet no evidence ever surfaced. The effect was pervasive, but undetectable, shaping strategies and outcomes while remaining completely out of reach of understanding. For those fighting below, it was a subtle whisper in the chaos, a ghostly presence that offered protection, guidance, and the faintest taste of hope in a galaxy that offered little else. John Cena's invisible presence on the battlefield became something more than mere observation. it became a silent guardianship over humanity itself. In the midst of the burning streets of a hive city under siege, Imperial guardsmen moved through rubble and smoke with an instinct they could not explain. A falling chunk of masonry veered at the last moment, missing a squad entirely. A last bolt fired from a chaos cultist spiraled harmlessly off its intended path, grazing only the scorched ground. No one saw him, and yet the effects of his interventions were undeniable, a subtle force bending the chaotic tide in favor of those who had little hope left. Soldiers whispered in awe and superstition, sensing an invisible hand that guided them through carnage that would have otherwise claimed their lives, calling it a miracle, without knowing the name behind it. From the sky above, Imperial aircraft swooped through ash-laden clouds, pilots reporting strange readings in their targeting arrays. Shots that should have missed enemy positions struck with unerring accuracy, while others that should have been fatal to friendly units somehow diverted. John Cena moved unseen between these currents of death, nudging the trajectory of fate with precision and care. He stepped over shattered streets, past pools of blood and shattered armor, ensuring that even the smallest acts of heroism by ordinary men and women could survive long enough to matter. His interventions were always subtle, almost imperceptible, but their ripple effects cascaded outward, leaving a trail of survival in a galaxy that had long forgotten what hope felt like. Orks and Tyranids alike began to experience frustration that defied their natural instincts. Ork warbands charged, their weapons raised in frenzied battle cries, only to trip over debris that seemed to shift at the last second, or slam into walls that weren't there moments before. Tyranid creatures, guided by synapse control and instinct, found their coordinated attacks faltering in impossible ways, as if an unseen force disrupted their hive-mind precision. Chaos cultists screamed in confusion as their plans fell apart without apparent cause, their spells misfiring and warp rituals collapsing mid-incantation. Even the most cunning and ruthless of these adversaries could not comprehend the invisible entity shaping their defeats. To them, it was not a man, not a soldier, but a phantom, a ghost, a legend in the making that moved through the galaxy, unseen yet unfailingly present. John Cena's movements were calculated yet fluid, threading through the battlefield like a ghostly conductor, orchestrating unseen notes in the symphony of war. Every step he took avoided direct confrontation, yet influenced events in ways no weapon or strategy could. He redirected falling debris to protect squads of guardsmen, subtly distracted enemy units to open paths for flanking maneuvers, and occasionally nudged the trajectory of bolter rounds with barely perceptible force. Each intervention was a delicate balance between exertion and restraint. Too much interference might expose him, too little could render his presence ineffective. In his own way, he became the hidden variable, a force that neither man nor machine could anticipate or account for, yet whose existence shaped the very outcomes of battle. Even the Space Marines, those genetically enhanced super soldiers, conditioned to perceive and respond to threats with almost supernatural precision, began to sense that something extraordinary moved among them. Bolters discharged with uncanny timing. Chainswords found their marks with preternatural accuracy, and ambushes were survived in ways that defied probability. Captain Valerian of the Ultramarines noted the phenomena in his log, struggling to reconcile the data with reality. There were no Xenos, no rogue psychers, no environmental anomalies that could account for the precise and beneficial interventions. The explanation lay beyond comprehension, manifesting only in the quiet acknowledgement of victories won through unseen hands. The legend of a guardian ghost began to form in hushed conversations, whispered among battle-weary warriors who had no idea who or what made the difference. In the chaos of ruined cities and battle-ravaged landscapes, John Cena's silent guardianship extended to the smallest acts of human courage. A young guardsman, clutching a plasma gun with trembling hands, found the courage to fire into a horde of charging mutants, his shot unnervingly precise. A squad of survivors, trapped behind collapsed walls, received miraculous openings just in time to escape death. All of these interventions occurred without recognition, without gratitude, yet their impact was profound. For those who survived, the sense of being watched over, protected by an unseen force, became a source of resilience. Even those who did not survive were subtly spared from total annihilation, their deaths less chaotic, their sacrifices imbued with the faintest touch of purpose, orchestrated from nowhere. The enemy's response grew increasingly erratic in the presence of the unseen champion. Chaos daemons hesitated as they sensed disruptions in the warp, their attacks losing cohesion, their movements faltering. Orks, normally heedless of strategy, fell into unexpected disarray, their charges thwarted by invisible obstacles. Tyranid swarms hesitated in mid-advance, confused by some ineffable interference that hindered their predatory instincts. To the invisible John Cena, each of these reactions was a signal, a rhythm to follow in shaping the course of survival and victory for humanity. He moved like a shadow among the living, precise in intervention, yet untouchable, weaving a tapestry of protection, confusion, and silent triumph across the battlefield. Every action he took created legends in motion. Reports of miraculous survival spread among the Imperium's forces. A tank spared by a misfired shell, the squad saved by the sudden collapse of enemy barricades, a psychic attack that inexplicably fizzled mid-cast. None could see him, none could name him, yet all could feel the results of his presence. He became a silent symbol of hope, an invisible shield for humanity in a galaxy dominated by endless war and ceaseless death. Even in the most hopeless moments, his subtle influence ensured that survival, however fleeting, remained possible. The whispers of an unseen protector grew louder with every engagement. A ghostly figure threading through history without leaving footprints, guiding the hearts and hands of those who fought in the Emperor's name. The Orks and Tyranids, creatures of instinct and unbridled aggression, began encountering an unprecedented hindrance on the battlefield. Ork war bosses bellowed orders, that should have driven their mobs with predictable chaos. But something invisible seemed to redirect their swings, misalign their charges, and scatter their forces in ways that defied their crude understanding of combat. Each stomp of a gargant or swing of a choppa occasionally failed in ways that appeared almost deliberate, as though the battlefield itself resisted their natural fury. Tyranid organisms, whose hive mind coordination allowed for devastatingly precise strikes, found their attacks faltering, swarms breaking formation at the last moment. For both Xenos forces, the invisible manipulations created an unnerving frustration, a force that mocked their instincts and made the simplest of maneuvers unreliable. They could sense a presence, intangible and unyielding, disrupting their dominance without ever engaging in open conflict. Across the ruined plains and shattered cities, the consequences of this unseen interference became evident in the survival of human forces. Guardsmen who should have fallen under the onslaught of Ork bullets or Tyranid claws found their attacks veering slightly, stumbling just enough to avoid catastrophe. Entire squads survived engagements that should have been suicidal, their endurance appearing almost supernatural. Even Space Marines, who often shrugged off waves of enemy attacks as routine, noticed subtle shifts in the battlefield that seemed to favor the defenders. Captain Lysandor, observing his veterans, could not reconcile the repeated pattern of survivals with chance or tactical brilliance alone. The invisible hand reshaped engagements, ensuring that even in the chaos of 40K warfare, humanity retained an unanticipated lifeline, a hidden guardian guiding fortune toward them without recognition or reward. Chaos cultists felt the disruption with growing paranoia. Rituals that should have summoned demons erupted in instability, warp energies spiraling unpredictably. Spells misfired or fizzled entirely, as if some imperceptible counterforce interfered with the very currents of the Imperium. Demons hesitated mid-assault, uncertain of the unseen entity affecting their influence on the material world. Even the most seasoned sorcerers of chaos struggled to maintain control, sensing the influence but unable to locate or confront it. Whispers of unseen interference spread among cultists, stories of a phantom champion or a spirit of the Emperor moving unseen to thwart their schemes. Fear and frustration mingled, as their habitual confidence in chaos and destruction crumbled under the subtle, invisible manipulations of a single unknown entity. In these encounters, John Cena moved like a ghostly force, threading between death and survival. He navigated streets scarred by bombardment, slipped between war machines and crashing debris, and intervened with precise timing. A collapsing roof barely missed a squad because an imperceptible nudge shifted its trajectory. Ork charges, wild and reckless, veered into obstacles at the last possible moment. Tyranid swarms, coordinated by instinct, fractured without visible cause. His presence, though undetectable, reshaped entire engagements. No one witnessed him, yet the results were undeniable. He became both shield and subtle manipulator, a silent force turning the tide without ever claiming recognition. Each act of interference reinforced the mythos growing among the Imperium's forces, a legend of the invisible protector who altered fate through unseen hands. Even mechanized war machines experienced disruptions that could not be explained by conventional means. Titans stomped over battlefields as their targeting systems recorded slight anomalies. Shots narrowly missing allies, explosions veering unpredictably. Ork walkers toppled inexplicably, their own momentum betrayed by imperceptible forces. Tyranid bioforms paused in the midst of their assault, reacting to invisible interference that defied logic. On the human side, weapons functioned just slightly better than expected, as if guided by a ghostly hand, ensuring that firepower hit where it mattered most. The battlefield itself seemed to obey a hidden rhythm, subtle shifts granting advantage to the unseen guardian's intentions. For the soldiers fighting below, the phenomenon was tangible in outcomes, even if completely invisible in form. A silent reassurance in the midst of ceaseless war. As these patterns repeated, the psychological impact on the enemy grew. Orks, creatures of instinct and rage, became confused and infuriated when repeated failures disrupted their usual chaos. Tyranid instincts, honed over millennia of evolution, betrayed them in ways they could not understand. Chaos forces, confident in the power of the warp and their dark patrons, felt unease creep into their minds, an intangible resistance they could not confront. The invisible presence became a force that shaped both strategy and fear, a subtle yet powerful entity that defied the expectations of every combatant in the theater of war. It was a phenomenon that worked quietly, invisibly, and decisively, altering the natural flow of carnage without ever exposing itself to scrutiny. Amidst the horror and destruction, human forces began to interpret the invisible interventions as miraculous or divine. Guardsmen whispered of a silent savior, while Space Marines speculated on a hidden champion sent by the Emperor himself. Every narrow survival, every unexpected success, seemed guided by the same unseen force. Soldiers felt the presence as a quiet reassurance, an invisible hand keeping them alive long enough to act with purpose. Even without seeing him, they became aware of patterns that defied normal probability, gestures and events that suggested a protector operating behind the veil of reality, ensuring that humanity could endure the horrors of the 41st millennium just a little longer. In the middle of collapsing cities and across war-torn plains, John Cena continued his subtle interventions. Orks tripped over rubble they shouldn't have noticed. Tyranid strikes missed their marks despite flawless instincts, and chaos sorcery fizzled unpredictably. No one could explain why these seemingly miraculous occurrences happened, but each saved life, each disrupted assault, reinforced the legend of an unseen champion. Even the most battle-hardened veterans began to adjust tactics, learning to trust invisible currents of fortune without understanding their origin. The battlefield itself had been altered not by weapons or strategy, but by the quiet, invisible presence of a single being moving unseen among the horrors of the galaxy. John Cena moved through the colossal war zones of the 40K galaxy, with a presence that was both invisible and undeniable. Entire battlefields sprawled beneath him, cities of stone and steel, reduced to smoldering ruins. Yet he moved like a ghost, threading through chaos. He observed the movements of Imperial guardsmen, space marines, and civilian refugees alike, noting the small, critical decisions that could mean life or death. His interventions were subtle but calculated. A tank's trajectory slightly altered, a falling beam nudged just enough to miss a squad, or an Ork charge subtly disrupted so that lives were spared. To those fighting, it seemed the war itself had developed a mind, favoring survival in inexplicable ways. Soldiers whispered about luck, divine intervention, or the Emperor's unseen hand, yet none could see the being who walked among them, shaping outcomes with silent precision. In the midst of a ruined hive city, Cena's invisible form navigated twisted streets and shattered plazas, avoiding the torrents of bolter fire and the wreckage of collapsed structures. His awareness of the battlefield was heightened to a near-omniscient level, seeing paths and consequences invisible to mortal eyes. Ork mobs screamed and charged, but miscalculated, as if the ground itself resisted their motion. Tyranid organisms, coordinated with ruthless instinct, faltered inexplicably, stepping into hazards that had not existed moments before. Chaos cultists, chanting and weaving warp energies into spells meant to annihilate, found their rituals misfiring at critical moments. Each subtle intervention by Cena reshaped battles at scales both minute and massive, his influence rippling outward like a stone cast into the Imperium, unseen yet tangible in its effects. The soldiers of the Imperium, unaware of his presence, began to exhibit an almost preternatural edge. Guardsmen ducked from plasma fire that should have been fatal. Bolter rounds struck with uncanny timing, and squads avoided ambushes with reflexes that seemed beyond human capability. Even the veteran space marines sensed the patterns without understanding them, noting that skirmishes ended with outcomes that defied statistical probability. Captain Arminius of the Blood Angels marveled at the repeated, subtle survivals that occurred in every engagement, recording the observations with meticulous detail, yet finding no plausible explanation. The presence altering the battlefield was not a machine, not a psychic entity, not even an enemy. It was something else entirely, moving unseen among the carnage, shaping events with imperceptible precision. High above the battlefield, the skies reflected the invisible hand, guiding the outcome of combat. Aircraft targeting arrays picked up faint anomalies, shots deviating ever so slightly from trajectories, missiles redirected by an unknown influence, explosions veering just enough to spare friendly units. Titans lumbered across the landscape, their targeting systems occasionally recording impossible deflections in munitions impact. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, obsessed with recording and understanding patterns, found themselves confounded by data that suggested manipulation without explanation. Sensors labeled anomalies as environmental interference, yet the truth defied understanding. A single unseen presence orchestrated survival, subtly rewriting the rules of engagement for the benefit of humanity. Amid the chaos, John Cena's interventions extended beyond mere survival. He guided movement in ways that allowed key personnel to regroup, directed firepower toward high-value targets with invisible nudges, and occasionally intervened in moments of critical heroism, ensuring that acts of bravery could succeed despite impossible odds. He did this without recognition, without acknowledgement, yet the effects were undeniable. Entire squads survived charges that should have obliterated them. Civilians escaped traps of collapsing buildings and flamers, and Space Marines executed maneuvers with an eerie, unseen assistance. Each intervention was delicate, calculated to ensure outcomes without revealing his existence, a choreography of invisibility that became more precise with each passing engagement. The enemy, sensing that something disrupted their usual dominance, grew increasingly paranoid. Ork mobs bellowed in frustration as their tactics consistently failed in unpredictable ways. Tyranid organisms hesitated mid-strike, instinct failing them in subtle, fatal ways. Chaos cultists panicked as warp energies destabilized at critical moments, their rituals collapsing under forces they could not comprehend. To the unseen John Cena, these reactions were signals guiding his next moves, subtle feedback that allowed him to prioritize interventions where lives hung by the thinnest threads. He became a silent puppeteer of the battlefield, moving between threads of survival and destruction, tipping scales without ever revealing the hand that did so. Within ruined cathedrals and collapsed plazas, the human narrative of heroism and survival intertwined with his invisible influence. Guardsmen performed actions that would otherwise have been impossible. Sniper shots connected against overwhelming odds, and medics reached casualties moments before death. Every intervention built on the last, creating a network of small miracles that cumulatively shaped the course of the war. John Cena's silent guardianship became more than a matter of timing or positioning. It was a force that inspired instinctive courage, protected the vulnerable, and allowed human will to flourish, even under overwhelming adversity. Rumors of the invisible champion began spreading among the Imperium's forces. Whispers circulated in the dim corners of bunkers and command centers about a spectral protector guiding events from beyond perception. Some soldiers credited the Emperor's divine will, while others speculated about unknown technology or Xenos intervention. But none could pinpoint the truth. The legend grew with every engagement where impossible survivals occurred, every tactical advantage that materialized without explanation. To John Cena, it was a quiet satisfaction, moving unseen, knowing the balance of life and death ticked slightly in favor of those who could not see him, yet owed everything to his silent presence. Chaos daemons, creatures of the warp with senses attuned to mortal fear and psychic resonance, began to feel a subtle, unnatural interference in their actions. Every assault they launched seemed to encounter resistance that was intangible yet profoundly effective. Attacks faltered just before reaching their target, their movements disrupted in ways that defied the instincts honed over millennia. Even the most powerful, greater daemons, who had terrorized entire worlds and bent mortals to their will, recoiled from the sensation of being subtly hindered by an invisible adversary. They could sense an external influence, an unseen presence that moved within the material plane and the immaterium simultaneously. Yet they could not perceive its form. Panic, frustration, and confusion began to ripple through their ranks, weakening the cohesion of their forces in subtle but devastating ways. On the battlefield, this unseen interference translated into tangible effects for humanity. Guardsmen found themselves unexpectedly evading psychic strikes, while Space Marines noticed warp-fueled attacks veering harmlessly off course. The invisible presence guided chaos into missteps, creating openings for tactical maneuvers that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Even the most disciplined Imperial commanders recognized that something beyond ordinary comprehension was at work. Reports of daemons halting mid-attack, cultists screaming in frustration as their rituals failed, and warp energies destabilizing at critical moments filtered up through the chain of command. Though no one could see him, John Cena's invisible form operated like a ghostly architect of survival, subtly tipping the scales in humanity's favor. The subtlety of his interventions was key. He did not strike directly, for to do so might compromise his invisibility. Instead, he nudged events, redirected the smallest factors, and allowed the chaos to unravel on its own in patterns he could manipulate without detection. A daemon charging toward a wounded squad would misstep on rubble that was subtly shifted by his presence. An arc of psychic energy would refract unpredictably in response to his movement, and spells cast by cultists would sputter at just the wrong instant. Each adjustment was measured and precise, preserving his invisibility while ensuring that the results consistently favored humanity. To mortal eyes, these events seemed miraculous, random, or divine. Yet the truth was that a single unseen warrior moved among them, threading an intricate web of influence through the battlefield. Even the daemons' natural confidence and aggression began to erode under this pressure. They sensed that something beyond the warp was observing and influencing, something capable of countering their might without direct confrontation. Lesser daemons faltered in formation, rifts in coordination that allowed Space Marines to exploit weaknesses that should not have existed. Greater daemons, usually unstoppable forces of destruction, found themselves hesitating, unsure if their own perceptions had been distorted by some external presence. The invisible champion created a paradox. Powerful forces that thrived on certainty and aggression now operated under subtle doubt, unsure whether every movement was entirely their own. In this way, John Cena's presence extended not only protection to humanity, but also a psychological manipulation of its enemies, bending even the warp-born creatures to uncertainty. The human soldiers themselves began to notice effects that seemed almost impossible. Bolter rounds fired from Imperial guardsmen struck with unerring accuracy against demonic adversaries that normally required psychic nullification to damage. Space Marines moved through warp-tainted fire with uncanny reflexes, evading lethal attacks that should have been unavoidable. Guardsmen, who would have perished in close combat, survived by mere inches, their instincts sharpened beyond natural limits. The presence of the invisible guardian lent humanity a subtle advantage that no strategy or technology could replicate. The whispered notion of a protective force began to circulate, creating morale and courage where despair had threatened to take root. Soldiers credited the emperor or even divine intervention, but no one knew the source, and yet all benefited from its constant, unseen hand. Even the most meticulous chaos sorcerers began to recognize the pattern of interference, their rituals and invocations failing at critical moments. Daemonic portals opened inconsistently, warp energies fluctuated without reason, and psychic assaults often fizzled unpredictably. Cultists turned on one another in frustration, uncertain whether their failures were due to incompetence, sabotage, or some higher power. Across entire battlefronts, the enemy became increasingly erratic, their confidence eroding under the weight of unseen control. John Cena, though invisible, exerted influence over both physical and psychic realms, creating a network of subtle interventions that protected life, preserved strategic positions, and ensured that humanity retained a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. As the war raged on, the invisible champion's presence became a ghostly constant, a rhythm beneath the chaos of fire and blood. Each action, each slight nudge, ensured that battles were not won purely by chance, but by a guiding force that remained undetected. Soldiers found hope in the impossible, surviving where all logic predicted death. The Imperium's leaders could not quantify the advantage, but it manifested repeatedly in the form of preserved lives. Successful maneuvers and enemy forces hindered in ways no one could explain. The myth of an unseen protector began to grow in whispers, reaching even the ears of those who had never glimpsed the battlefield firsthand. It was an influence felt rather than seen, shaping the tide of war without ever revealing its source. Through destroyed cities, blasted plains, and warp-infused battlefields, John Cena's invisible presence continued to manipulate events subtly yet decisively. Daemons faltered, cultists panicked, orcs stumbled, and Tyranids hesitated. Human soldiers survived improbable attacks, executed flawless maneuvers, and found courage in impossible circumstances. Each ripple of influence carried the hallmarks of intelligence, timing, and precision, threading through the chaos of war like an invisible thread of fate. Those who fought would never see him, never acknowledge him, and yet every life saved, every strategy enabled, bore the quiet touch of the unseen champion moving among them, bending the universe just enough to ensure that humanity could endure against impossible odds. John Cena, though invisible, began experimenting with the strange mechanics and alien technologies scattered across the 40K battlefields. Among the ruins of Mechanicus laboratories and demon-haunted factories, he observed devices that bent the very fabric of reality. Void shields flickering with energy, teleportation arrays sparking unpredictably, and corrupted machinery that pulsed with malignant warp power. With no one to notice, he moved between these technological marvels, testing the limits of his invisible presence. He touched levers and buttons lightly, shifting energy flows without causing catastrophic damage. Curious how a human, unseen and unbound by observation, could subtly manipulate the constructs of war. Every adjustment sent ripples through the battlefield, altering outcomes in ways neither human nor Xenos could comprehend. The Adeptus Mechanicus, obsessed with precision and control, recorded anomalies with their sensors, unable to understand their source. Machines responded inconsistently. Void shields on battle platforms activated slightly earlier or later than intended, protecting squads from volleys of Ork fire or stray Tyranid claws. Teleportation arrays misfired with minute variations, redirecting key units to advantageous positions by accident, or so it seemed. Chaos cultists watched their warp-infused machinery fail unpredictably, whispering about the Emperor's will intervening against them. None could pinpoint the cause. John Cena, invisible and careful, tested and observed, learning the delicate balance of interference, ensuring that his actions helped humanity without ever exposing himself to observation. He became a silent engineer of war, guiding the flow of technology as effortlessly as he did the physical battlefield. In the vast corridors of daemon-infested manufactorums, John Cena discovered opportunities to turn chaos itself against its practitioners. Machines corrupted by warp energies pulsed erratically, but with precise nudges, he redirected circuits, causing bursts of fire that hit only enemy forces while leaving humans unharmed. Tyranid bio-titans, massive and terrifying, tripped over obstacles he subtly shifted. Ork war machines fell into ruins they could have otherwise crushed. Even the smallest adjustments in machinery or environmental hazards saved lives or disrupted enemy plans. The invisible nature of his interventions allowed him to act freely, yet with immense responsibility. One miscalculation could lead to human casualties or alert enemy forces to his presence. Each action became a carefully considered step in a silent dance with fate itself. He experimented with teleportation devices, sensing their ability to manipulate space in ways utterly foreign to human understanding. By activating arrays in precise sequences, entire squads were shifted just far enough to avoid overwhelming attacks. Guardsmen found themselves suddenly behind cover. Space Marines appeared where strategic advantage demanded, and enemy ambushes missed entirely. To the soldiers and commanders, these occurrences seemed miraculous, acts of chance or divine will. The Mechanicus recorded unexplained energy fluctuations, their cogitators unable to process the invisible manipulations. John Cena learned to respect the delicate balance of these technologies, understanding that interference required subtlety. Too much, and he would be detected. Too little, and humanity would suffer avoidable losses. The battlefield became a laboratory for his invisible interventions. He moved between destroyed cities, mechanized fortresses, and corrupted factories, nudging critical machinery at just the right moment. Bolter turrets aimed more accurately than they should have. Void shields absorbed attacks that would have leveled squads, and experimental weapons activated at opportune times to tip engagements in humanity's favor. Even daemonic engines, creatures of pure warp energy, found themselves delayed or redirected by invisible interference with the machinery and environment surrounding them. John Cena's actions transformed chance into calculated influence, a blend of timing, understanding, and invisibility that no living being could replicate. The enemy sensed, vaguely and unnervingly, that some force manipulated both technology and battlefield outcomes. Ork walkers misstepped in ways that could not be explained. Tyranid organisms faltered despite instinctive coordination, and chaos sorcerers grew frustrated as their devices failed at crucial moments. Each intervention reinforced the invisible guardian's influence, leaving the enemy unsettled, cautious, and increasingly predictable in their errors. Even the most experienced warriors began to adjust their strategies, unknowingly playing into the hands of a force they could neither see nor counter. In this way, John Cena's experiments with machines and warp-affected technologies amplified his silent guardianship, making his invisible presence felt even without direct confrontation. Human forces began to notice a pattern in what they called luck, survival, or the Emperor's favor. Strategic advantages appeared in improbable ways. Equipment performed beyond expectations, and critical timing seemed orchestrated by an unseen hand. Soldiers whispered about a spectral guide, invisible yet influencing both physical and technological outcomes. John Cena moved through this complex web of machines, energy flows, and warp-tinged constructs with precision, experimenting continuously while remaining undetectable. His invisible interventions reshaped the battlefield, creating a network of influence that protected lives, disrupted enemy plans, and preserved humanity's chances in a galaxy defined by chaos and destruction. Even in the midst of catastrophic destruction, he found opportunities to refine his interventions. Exploding plasma reactors veered just enough to avoid human casualties. Collapsing buildings shifted slightly to provide cover for retreating squads, and experimental mechanized devices performed in ways that defied reason. Every adjustment, every silent manipulation, enhanced humanity's ability to survive impossible encounters. By mastering the interaction between invisibility, human intuition, and alien technology, John Cena became more than a guardian. He became an unseen architect of survival, weaving influence through both natural and artificial elements of war, leaving traces of miracles that no one could witness, but all could feel. As John Cena moved invisibly across the battlefields of the 40K galaxy, his silent interventions began to take on a mythic quality. Among human soldiers, whispers of a hidden champion spread like wildfire. Guardsmen told stories of near-miraculous survivals, as if some unseen hand had guided their shots or shielded them from death. Space Marines noted inexplicable advantages in the thick of combat, enemies misstepping, attacks diverted at the last moment. and their own squads seemingly imbued with an unexplainable precision. Word of the invisible protector reached command centers and bunkers, and slowly a legend began to form, a figure who moved unseen, yet shaped the very course of battles with impossible timing and subtlety, earning the moniker of the Unseen Emperor's Champion. The myth resonated most strongly with the ordinary soldiers who faced annihilation daily. A young guardsman crouching behind shattered cover during a chaos assault might glance up to see debris falling perilously close, yet missing him by inches, unaware that Cena had nudged it ever so slightly. A squad of Imperial survivors, trapped in a collapsing building, found egress just in time, their escape facilitated by imperceptible shifts in rubble. Each act of salvation seemed miraculous, reinforcing belief in an invisible protector. Even the most hardened veterans, whose experiences had taught them to rely solely on skill and firepower, began to perceive patterns in survival that could not be attributed to chance. In their hearts, the legend of the Unseen Emperor's Champion grew, a beacon of hope in a galaxy dominated by death and despair. Chaos forces were less impressed and more unsettled. Demons, accustomed to fear and domination, recoiled from the subtle interference that disrupted their assaults. Spells fizzled, charges faltered, and warp energies fluctuated inexplicably. Orks, usually unthinking in their aggression, stumbled at the last possible moments, as if the ground itself conspired against them. Tyranid organisms broke formation or hesitated mid-strike for no reason their instincts could account for. To these forces, the invisible champion became an anomaly they could sense but never engage. Their frustration grew into paranoia, weakening cohesion and opening vulnerabilities that human defenders could exploit, often without realizing why victory came easier than expected. Even the Imperium's leaders began to notice the invisible influence. Reports of battles won through improbable events filtered up to regimental commanders and chapter masters. Tactical analyses noted repeated survival against overwhelming odds, unexplainable coordination among scattered units, and moments where enemy forces faltered without cause. Yet, no sensors, no psychers, no scrying arrays could detect the source. The phenomenon challenged even the most logical minds, creating a sense of awe that bordered on reverence. Commanders began to adapt their strategies, unconsciously incorporating the influence of the invisible champion into their planning, trusting the subtle hand that seemed to guide fortune in humanity's favor. John Cena's actions also had unintended cultural effects among the troops. Stories of the invisible guardian spread quickly through whispered conversations, exaggerated in the telling, but always grounded in the strange patterns of survival and success that soldiers experienced firsthand. In the midst of war, morale began to shift. Even those who were skeptical found themselves inspired by improbable survivals, gaining courage in situations that had previously seemed hopeless. The myth of the unseen champion transcended fear and exhaustion, becoming a psychological pillar for human endurance. Soldiers believed that someone or something was watching over them, that even when the odds were insurmountable, they were not entirely alone. The legend began to influence behavior on the battlefield itself. Soldiers moved with slightly more confidence, firing with steadier hands, advancing through perilous zones with unexpected resolve. The presence of the invisible champion, though unseen, shaped not only outcomes but attitudes, fostering bravery and resilience where fear might otherwise have dominated. Even the most chaotic situations began to reflect subtle order, as if a guiding hand threaded through the carnage, nudging events toward survival. John Cena, in his invisible capacity, became a force not merely of intervention, but of inspiration, reinforcing humanity's capacity to endure through sheer subtle influence. Enemies became increasingly aware that something unusual influenced outcomes. Chaos cultists began to suspect interference by the Emperor himself or a powerful psyker. Orks grew frustrated by repeated failures, their instincts consistently undermined by unseen factors. Tyranid commanders, if such creatures could be called that, hesitated in the face of inexplicable disruptions, losing cohesion in ways that made them vulnerable. The invisible champion's impact was subtle yet pervasive, shaping both human and Xenos behavior. While the Imperium did not know his identity, the mythic reputation of the unseen Emperor's champion grew with every skirmish, whispered among soldiers as a guardian spirit, acting silently but decisively. The nature of Cena's interventions ensured that the myth retained its mysterious allure. He never acted visibly, never engaged directly in combat with recognition. Every success, every survival remained a product of invisibility and precise timing. The more humans credited him in awe or devotion, the more the legend became a part of the cultural fabric of war. Stories spread not only of battles won, but of moments where death itself had seemed to bend around the invisible champion, where survival appeared guided by some higher or unknowable power. In this way, the myth of the unseen Emperor's champion evolved, growing stronger with each telling, reinforcing humanity's perseverance against impossible odds. As John Cena continued to move silently through shattered battlefields, he became a symbol beyond mere intervention. He embodied hope, subtle guidance, and the inexplicable hand that occasionally shaped destiny without being seen. His presence inspired stories, belief, and courage, even as he remained utterly invisible, unknown to all, yet profoundly impactful. Soldiers attributed impossible survivals to him. Enemies grew wary of unseen interference, and commanders adapted unconsciously to the subtle shifts he caused. The legend of the unseen Emperor's champion became an invisible thread weaving through the tapestry of war, a ghostly force shaping the fates of countless lives in ways none could fully comprehend. The presence of John Cena, invisible yet profoundly influential, began to shape the very course of strategic operations in the 40K galaxy. commanders noticed improbable patterns in the survival and effectiveness of their troops. Entire regiments, which would have been obliterated under normal circumstances, found openings in the chaos of battle that allowed them to hold lines, regroup, and counterattack. Squads of guardsmen survived volleys of bolter fire by mere inches. Tanks avoided critical hits that should have destroyed them, and Space Marines executed flanking maneuvers with uncanny precision. These events, seemingly miraculous, were the direct result of Cena's invisible interventions, nudging the flow of war without ever revealing his presence to friend or foe. In the heart of ruined hive cities and shattered fortresses, Cena moved silently through the carnage, adjusting outcomes with subtle precision. A collapsing structure was shifted just enough to provide cover for retreating troops, while enemy squads misstepped into traps they could not have foreseen. Orc mobs, charging with predictable brutality, faltered at the last instant, as if guided by an unseen hand. Tyranid organisms hesitated mid-strike, their instincts disrupted by imperceptible influence. Chaos cultists, performing rituals with lethal intent, saw their warp-infused spells fail at critical moments. Each small intervention rippled outward, changing the trajectory of battles in ways that no human, Xenos, or machine could account for. Yet the results were undeniable and consistently advantageous for humanity. The Imperium's leaders, though unaware of the source, began to adapt their strategies around the improbable survivals and interventions that repeated across the war zones. Captains and regimental commanders noticed patterns, squads saved against impossible odds, enemy formations collapsing inexplicably, and critical reinforcements arriving at precisely the right moments. Tactical analysts could not find a coherent explanation, as sensor data, psychic readings, and strategic logs all pointed to randomness. Yet those on the ground instinctively adjusted, as if guided by a hidden hand. The invisible champion's influence extended beyond the physical battlefield. It shaped morale, confidence, and the instincts of soldiers in ways no one could quantify, reinforcing the resilience of human forces. Every interaction John Cena had with the battlefield was precise, delicate, and invisible. He avoided direct combat that would expose him, instead redirecting debris, subtly influencing the trajectory of gunfire, and nudging enemy movements just enough to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Guardsmen survived encounters with Orks or Tyranids that should have been fatal, and Space Marines found openings in the thickest enemy lines without understanding why. Each action was carefully measured to preserve invisibility while maximizing effect. Over time, his interventions became a web of unseen influence, connecting moments of survival, opportunity, and tactical advantage in a pattern imperceptible to anyone except the unseen architect orchestrating it. The psychological effect on both friend and foe was profound. Human soldiers gained confidence and courage, sensing that even when circumstances seemed hopeless, a force was guiding them toward survival. Orks, whose instincts relied on predictable aggression, became frustrated and erratic, misjudging terrain and tactics. Tyranid organisms faltered mid-strike, instinctive coordination failing in subtle ways. Chaos cultists panicked as spells and rituals failed unpredictably. Their confidence undermined by forces they could neither perceive nor understand. John Cena's invisible presence shaped not only the physical flow of battle, but the mental state of combatants, creating advantages that were both tangible and psychological. Through the ruins of manufactorums, hive cities, and battlefield debris, Cena extended his influence over the machinery of war as well. Experimental weapons misfired in ways that spared human lives while damaging enemies. Titans, walking artillery platforms, had their targeting systems subtly adjusted by invisible interventions, ensuring that firepower struck the right targets at the right moments. Vehicles veered around hazards they would have otherwise collided with, while enemy engines of war became unreliable under his subtle manipulations. Even warp-infused machines deployed by cultists faltered, their energy flows disrupted without warning. Each intervention combined precision, timing, and invisibility, demonstrating a mastery of both human and technological elements of warfare. The invisible champion's presence also shaped the narrative of the battlefield. Soldiers began whispering tales of a guardian they could not see, attributing their survival and improbable successes to a protective force. The legend of the unseen Emperor's champion spread among the ranks, providing hope and courage even in dire circumstances. Every miraculous survival, every unexpected victory, reinforced belief in a force acting silently in humanity's favor. Commanders began incorporating what seemed like patterns of luck into tactical planning, unaware that the pattern was in fact the result of Cena's invisible guidance, shaping decisions and outcomes in subtle but decisive ways. Even the deadliest threats to humanity felt the impact of his invisible hand. Daemons, accustomed to fear and dominance, hesitated in battle, their attacks disrupted at crucial moments. Orc mobs misstepped and collided with obstacles they should have ignored. Tyranid swarms faltered mid-charge, leaving gaps that human forces exploited with deadly precision. Chaos cultists, attempting to unleash catastrophic warp energies, found their rituals failing unpredictably. Through every encounter, John Cena's interventions created a network of influence, ensuring that humanity retained a chance for survival against seemingly insurmountable odds, all while remaining unseen and unknowable to friend and foe alike. The legend of John Cena, invisible yet devastatingly influential, reached its peak during a massive confrontation on a war-torn agri-world at the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus. Imperial forces, already stretched thin, were on the verge of collapse under the combined onslaught of Orc warbands and Chaos cultists empowered by warp-infused daemonic allies. Entire regiments were decimated before reaching the front lines, and civilians huddled in the ruins of shattered cities prayed silently for any form of salvation. Yet, moving unseen through the chaos, Cena's presence began to orchestrate events with uncanny precision. Bolts of fire glanced harmlessly off advancing troops. Collapsing buildings shifted to provide unexpected cover, and the ground itself seemed to conspire against enemy forces without a detectable source. Every imperceptible action became a thread in the tapestry of survival that only he could weave. As he moved between debris and shattered streets, Cena observed patterns that no human commander could anticipate. Orc mobs charged with their predictable brutality, yet obstacles that weren't there moments before impeded their paths, scattering them into traps that existed only because of his subtle influence. Tyranid organisms hesitated mid-strike, instinct faltering, as if the hive mind itself sensed interference. Chaos sorcerers' rituals, meant to summon demonic reinforcements or corrupt entire districts, fizzled at critical moments, energy arcs misaligning and portals collapsing. Even the most disciplined Imperial units benefited indirectly from his actions. Guardsmen survived near-fatal encounters, Space Marines found gaps in enemy lines, and civilians escaped destruction by mere inches. The battlefield became a canvas, and Cena, unseen, was the artist shaping it with quiet, invisible strokes. The psychological effect of his presence reverberated across both sides. Human soldiers, unaware of why they survived repeated near catastrophes, began to act with unexpected courage. Bullets found their marks with improbable accuracy. Squads coordinated in ways that exceeded prior training, and morale, previously on the brink of collapse, held firm. Conversely, Orks became increasingly erratic, their instinct-driven charges failing, leading to internal confusion and sporadic collisions. Tyranid forces, normally the embodiment of unrelenting precision, fractured mid-assault, opening critical vulnerabilities. Chaos cultists, desperate to complete rituals and secure dominance, grew paranoid and disorganized as warp energies reacted unpredictably. The invisible champion manipulated not only physical outcomes, but also the mental state of all combatants, creating cascading advantages that could not be quantified or rationally explained. John Cena's interventions were never brute force. They were subtle, precise, and orchestrated for maximum effect. A falling wall might save a squad at the perfect moment. A stray projectile might be nudged to strike an enemy leader, and environmental hazards were timed to hinder aggressors without alerting them to the source. Every act required careful calculation. Too little, and soldiers could die needlessly. Too much, and his invisibility might be compromised. This careful modulation of influence created a perfect balance between intervention and discretion, allowing him to remain completely unseen while profoundly altering the outcomes of skirmishes, platoon maneuvers, and large-scale engagements. Mechanized war machines, experimental weapons, and even warp-infused devices became instruments in Cena's silent orchestration. Titans strayed slightly from their calculated paths to avoid friendly units. Experimental mechanicist weapons discharged at moments perfectly aligned with enemy missteps, and daemon engines faltered unpredictably as he influenced the battlefield's energy flows. To those observing, It appeared as if luck favored the Imperium with improbable consistency. Commanders could not explain the patterns, sensor readings were inconsistent, and psychers reported disturbances that defied comprehension. Yet every adjustment, every imperceptible nudge was the result of Cena's unseen presence, ensuring the survival of humanity in a galaxy that seemed determined to annihilate it. Even the smallest, most chaotic encounters bore his fingerprints. Guardsmen in narrow alleys survived encounters with Ork knobs who would have otherwise slaughtered them. Civilians fleeing from collapsing structures found escape routes that did not exist moments prior. Space Marines executed critical strikes against demonic entities without understanding how they could penetrate impossible defenses. These moments, seemingly miraculous, became woven into the daily experience of the battlefield. The Imperium's forces, though unaware of the true cause, adjusted their behavior subtly in response to the invisible champion, acting with confidence and coordination that belied their desperate circumstances. The enemy's growing frustration amplified Cena's effectiveness. Orks, increasingly unpredictable, failed to coordinate, their instinctive aggression undermined by invisible obstacles. Tyranid bioforms misjudged movements, leaving gaps for lethal counterattacks. Chaos cultists' rituals continued to fail or misfire, further sowing discord. The psychological warfare, combined with the subtle manipulation of physical events, ensured that the invisible champion's presence extended beyond direct intervention. He shaped patterns of action, reaction, and morale in ways that no conventional weapon could replicate. Every maneuver became an extension of his unseen influence. Every survival a testament to his quiet mastery over the battlefield. As the battle stretched on, the legend of the invisible protector solidified among human forces. Soldiers, seeing the impossible happen repeatedly, spoke in hushed tones about the unseen emperor's champion, attributing their survival and small victories to a ghostly guardian moving among them. Commanders, while still bound by tactical doctrine, adjusted strategies instinctively in response to inexplicable advantages. Even in the thick of war, with entire cities reduced to rubble and millions of lives at stake, humanity found hope through acts that could not be explained by conventional means. The invisible champion's orchestration of survival, skill, and timing became a defining factor in the conflict, ensuring that the Imperium retained a fighting chance against overwhelming forces in a galaxy ruled by chaos, xenos, and death.